everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Do More podcast. Today I have with me the wonderful Dr. Jessica Horler, who is a specialist in systems thinking and monitoring, evaluation and learning, which I guess we'll refer to as MUL throughout the podcast so that you know. But yeah, Jess, thanks for joining us today. It's awesome to have you here.
It's awesome to be here.
So as you know, the foundation is full of play. And so we have a playful check-in question for you today, but we'll keep our guests in suspense. So I'll ask you the question and you'll answer it at the end of the podcast. So if you could design or create any magical tool, so think outside of the box, like don't think AI, think like magical, a tool that could make research easier, whichever part of the process, what do you think that tool would be?
Okay, I'm gonna hope our conversation kind of unravels that as we go, because I can't think of anything right now.
Okay, awesome. So because our professional paths have crossed a few times this year, I know that you've had like a jam-packed year and also managed to complete your PhD and become a doctor. Well done. I really don't know how you've done it all, but you have. So I guess a good starting point would be if you could tell us a bit more about your background and what inspired you to pursue your PhD in program evaluation.
So my background is actually in psychology. So I did my undergraduate and my honors in psychology. And by the time we got to honors, I think they try and discourage as many people from doing masters in psychology as possible. So it was the first time I'd heard of program evaluation was in my honors class, because they were telling us about all these like other fun careers you can do with a psychology and research background. So I thought it sounded really cool because I get to do research, social science research, but on a larger scale and with kind of social impact. And I really loved working with NGOs at the time. I did a lot of volunteering. So that really appealed to me. So I did my master's in program evaluation. And at the time it was just a year. And then, I went straight into consulting at that point. And I was doing consulting for a few years and kind of started a consultancy with some colleagues. And I kind of gravitated towards early childhood development quite organically just because of the projects I was working on and the people I was working with. And it just kind of stuck. I think I just found myself in this very appealing sector, and everyone feels like the work they do is the most important work on earth, but I really do feel like ECD is the most important work on earth. And so then in 2019, I started kind of toying with the idea of doing a PhD because I was enjoying the projects I was on, but I really wanted something that was mine. I think maybe that's like a pathological problem with consultants is this need for independence and to pursue your autonomy. And I had all these ideas and I really wanted to pursue something, but I couldn't quite find like the right consulting project to fit what I wanted to do. So a PhD just seemed like a fun way to do something I was interested in. I wasn't really thinking like long-term academia, anything like that. I just wanted to do a cool project.
That's quite a jump, but I think it definitely speaks to your passion. And I think anyone that has met you will know that you are so passionate about ECD and especially evaluation in that space. So awesome. So you became interested in incorporating systems thinking into MUL, monitoring and evaluation. And what benefits have you seen this like bringing into the field? You speak of the consultancy and like kind of how do you merge that into the current work that you're doing?
So at the time, originally I wanted to focus on not systems thinking. I wanted to look at organizations, like the actual organizational development and culture and leadership of NGOs and how that impacts on the effectiveness of ECD programs and the ability to create impact. And when I was researching it at the time, it was 2020. I registered in February 2020. So then everything kind of went out the window with COVID, obviously. And then when I was learning more and more about what I could do, I came across these really interesting books on organizational effectiveness that spoke about systems thinking as a way to understand how organizations thrive. And that kind of got me thinking about how that's always felt like the missing puzzle piece in Mel for me, is that we very much focus in on these small little outputs or these numbers or these even impacts and outcomes. They're not really systemic in the way we understand things. And we know that social change is not this really simple thing that you can boil down to a log frame, but it's what we do anyway. And the more I started reading about systems thinking, the more I was like, oh, this is it. This is the way we can understand. It makes sense, finally. So it was, in my mind, it was a really cool way. I think a lot of people now are getting onto this whole systems change, systems thinking movement, but a lot of it is to do with kind of the sectoral system, like how could we change the system in terms of the government, in terms of policy, whereas I was actually quite interested on a smaller scale at the organizational system. And I think, that's where my interest was. And I think there's a lot of exciting work in systems change that a lot of people are doing, and I just felt like maybe the institutional system is kind of forgotten along the way, and there's a lot of power there as well in terms of changing how organizations see themselves, in terms of how they see themselves within the sector, in terms of how they understand what they're doing and designing their programs. So that's why I saw a really interesting niche.
In terms of being in the field and doing this type of work, do you think like there are live application examples that you can think of where you've been like, the reason, like if we've applied systems thinking here, this is why the outcome is better? Or is it a work in progress?
A bit of both. So my PhD was, I trialed this idea. I created a Mel workshop toolkit where I went through a 5-workshop process with with 2 NGOs, and it was all designed around using systems thinking tools and methodologies to develop their ML framework. So it wasn't so much like a completely revolutionary, radical systems change initiative, but it was doing something fairly traditional, but using a different conceptual lens. And I think it was great. There was a lot of... There was a lot of challenges, a lot of limitations, which we can talk about, but it was particularly useful in terms of developing program theory and theory of change. And that's, I think, where it really clicked into place for me to see how these concepts can really come to life. And I found that the NGOs responded really well to that. And in my consulting work alongside, I've tried to bring in more of those concepts and ideas into theory of change development in particular, because that's a lot of the work that I do. And yeah, it's really like, it just helps people think a bit differently about their work, think a bit more broadly, understand the problem that they're trying to address a bit more clearly.
So are your tools called the Dr. Horler tools then? Your toolkit? Or is it a bit more of a generic name?
It's very generic. I don't think I could ever call it the Dr. Horler's toolkit without dying a little bit on the inside. It had like a very generic working title for the dissertation called The Systems Approach to MEL, or SAML, SIML, I don't know. But I haven't quite, I've just finished. It's December 12th today. Let your viewers just appreciate that we're on December 12th. So my brain's fried. And I think towards, next year, I'm going to think about how I can make this a bit more available and a bit more usable for more people.
Amazing. So you've shared now like a bit about the practicality, but could you maybe share like the main findings of your dissertation?
Yeah. So as I said, the whole dissertation was about developing this toolkit. So I was quite entrenched in the systems thinking literature, and then trialing it with NGOs and ECD. And yeah, I think it was qualitative in nature, so there weren't any kind of statistical findings, but the themes that really emerged were around organizational culture and learning and the role of the funder a lot of the time. So what happened in the workshops was, we were like having these amazing, really rich, nuanced conversations around what these NGOs are trying to do, what's the very like complex, dynamic problem situation they're working in. And, what I love about theory of change workshops in particular is how, and you'll know this, is how like just the richness and the detail and the ideas and the innovation that comes up in those conversations are just something else. You really see the best of people, and you really like see the passion and the commitment and the dedication in the room. And all these workshops were really powerful, but a constant limitation we kept coming up against was, but we can't do it that way because of our funders, and we can't design our programs in this way because our grant doesn't allow for that, or our funders don't allow for that, or it doesn't fit in with the proposal, the grant. So in terms of the actual design of the program, that was quite a significant limitation. And I think this affects different NGOs differently. Some NGOs are less dependent on grants and maybe have something more open-ended, and they have a bit more autonomy. Whereas others, have a lot less autonomy in the design of their intervention. So that was on the one end. And in terms of the actual MEL and reporting, also, like a lot of the things we wanted to capture, we couldn't necessarily because the funder wanted to see something else. And of course, we know NGOs are really resource constrained. So if you're funneling, you're going to prioritize what your funder wants, and you're going to prioritize your data collection and your systems towards what you need to survive. So that was a major limitation. But yeah, as I said, the systems thinking had a lot of benefit and a lot of advantage for kind of strategic planning, strategic decision making, designing programs. That was a super powerful finding. But at the same time, so there's always an advantage and a trade-off, is that, the organizations came up with these really robust and powerful potential strategic, interventions, but the organization themselves didn't necessarily have the capacity or the resources to actually, bring it to fruition. So there is this tension between doing like a really robust and really interesting and nuanced kind of strategy, but then actually being quite constrained in your ability to implement it.
So I guess you speak of the barriers, and one of them being the funders. And so if the funder is such a significant barrier in some ways because of, the scope of their work or their funding, how does that then influence the development of the theory of change as well as the log frames? Because obviously is the funding over 5 years or 10 years, and is that why they have such a significant sway? Or is this more at the like micro level, like we fund you for a year and yet they still have that amount of sway?
I mean, it's tricky to answer because so many organizations, have different funding frameworks and apply for different kinds of grants. But I think what often ends up happening is it's kind of like a chicken or egg situation. Is it that the funder requirements come before the MEL, or the MEL comes before the funder requirements? And a lot of the time, an organization will only develop a theory of change in response to a proposal. So then they get locked into that, and the funder wants them to deliver on that particular document. So it's not, you obviously get a lot of organizations who start with a theory of change and they say, this is it. And then they present it, and funders either buy into it or they don't. And that's obviously maybe a bit more, powerful way to do it, because then you kind of get to stand your ground in that sense. But it often doesn't happen that way. And a lot of funders, even if it's a short-term contract, maybe a year, really, depending on the culture that they have around monitoring, evaluation, and learning in particular is how kind of flexible or rigid they're going to be. So, some really adhere to this like results-based management approach where it's all about, your ability to deliver and be accountable to whatever you planned. And I think I won't name kinds of funders here because that wouldn't be very professionally strategic of me to do. But, you do hear these kinds of, honestly, these horror stories where a funder is so rigid and they will hold you to that exact target and that exact number that you stipulated before you'd even really become like super entrenched in this particular program. So things change. I mean, the success of any kind of program is your ability to adapt and be agile and responsive. And it's a pity that a lot of organizations get kind of locked into these more rigid contracts where they can't. They have to just deliver on whatever that number was, even though that isn't actually super relevant or helpful anymore. So yeah, it very much depends on the funder themselves and what kind of like learning and management orientation they subscribe to.
That's crazy. And even thinking of developmental work, like trying to hit a target that you've set like a few years back, it's almost impossible actually when you understand the landscape and the system that we work within. So that's crazy. I guess a final question is around your experience on the most effective ways to engage community in the evaluation process. I mean, we're hoping that organizations are able to do their MEL before they seek funding, but as you know, that's not often the case. So yeah, how do we effectively engage communities in the evaluation process, as well as the actual organizations who need to create MEL systems?
Yeah, I think a lot of the literature says that it starts with leadership, and when it comes to evaluation, building evaluation capacity within organizations. And I think that's in my experience, that's very true, is depending on how the leadership of the organization understands the role of MEL evaluation, it's going to trickle down into the way the entire process unfolds. So I think for me, that's almost the most important thing, is to develop really strong evaluative capacity at the leadership level, and not in terms of technical skill, more in terms of like an appreciation for the learning and becoming really committed to being a learning organization, which I think everyone talks about, but not a lot of people really have the ability to do for various reasons. So that would be kind of my top of my wish list. And then in terms of engaging communities, I think that's also a really oftentimes neglected part of evaluation, especially when you're bringing in kind of big consultancies or consultants who just have a job that they want to get done and they need to do it quickly because, they're tight turnaround times, there's a tight budget, time is money. And you and I, at the SEMEA conference this year, we heard a lot about how engaging communities and bringing communities into the evaluation process is really time-consuming process. It's not something you can rush and do quickly, and there's often just not budget for that. So my second thing on the wish list would be create a bigger budget if you want a more inclusive evaluation. And then there are like millions of different ways you can go about doing that in terms of engaging community leaders, running forums and, focus groups beforehand to actually involve them and co-create the evaluation design with them, as opposed to a funder saying, okay, we want you to answer these questions according to the DAC criteria, but maybe the community actually wants to know something different. Maybe they want to hold this organization accountable in a different way. And there's often not a lot of priority given to those questions.
Yeah, and for sure budget, right? I think that's, I don't think people know how expensive it actually is to go and be in community and really have the time to hear the voices. Wow, that's awesome. I mean, this has been so insightful, and maybe we can link your PhD dissertation down in the link below so people can read it on their December holidays. So I guess the final question then was our playful check-in. And so what innovative or magical tool would you like to envision or develop that could change the research process?
I don't know, like the first thing really is just that comes to mind is this like, you know, like genie bottle where you can rub it and then you get 3 wishes and you can design your research in a completely unconstrained way. So maybe one of them can be unlimited funding, where I can design my research however I want to do, with, you know, copious amounts of funding. I think anything that guarantees a bit of freedom and autonomy around the research process is definitely something I would wish for. Yeah.
I love that. We can give your genie a good name too. Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's really been so insightful, and we look forward to how our paths will cross again in the MEL space, but also as you work alongside the Do More Foundation. We really value your input and expertise. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to do anything with the Do More Foundation.
Playtime.